Um, Good afternoon. This is Nancy Zach. It's November 26, 2012, and we are doing an interview with Bob Cartwright, who was an employee for the Ironbound Community Corporation for 14 years, from 1977 to 1991, and you were very involved with the fights against the garbage incinerator and other environmental issues that the community was facing at that time. So we wanted to ask a few questions and see what you can tell us about that time and about your role in those fights. So I will start by asking a little bit about your role in researching the issues, Bob. I know that you played a key role and that the work you did was very important. Can you talk about some of those issues that you did research for and how that was able to affect the outcomes of the struggles?
Yeah, I guess the two that where the research paid off the most was in the struggle against SCA. They wanted to set up a toxic waste incinerator in the island section of Ironbound. And when I started looking into it, what we found was a lot of connections between organized crime and that corporation, and as well as a lot of environmental problems that they had in other states. And by putting that stuff together, we developed a very strong critique of SCA and their ability to safely handle the toxic waste that they wanted to bring into Ironbound to put into the incinerator.
And then can you say a little more about the organized crime involvement?
At this point, I don't remember that much about it, right? This is work from, of course, 30 years ago, more than 30 years ago.
Right.
And at that time, the garbage industry was very connected with organized crime, and that particular corporation was linked in. And we had access to some information that had been put forward at the U.S. Congress. There was a man who at that time was, I think, a sergeant on the New Jersey State Police. And he had done a lot of work of connecting the dots with some of these companies. And he then was asked to testify before a congressional committee, and then I came across his testimony, and then that helped us get on the right track with taking a look at what the corporation was all about.
Okay, so were you able to, you said you were able to produce a critique of SCA and then use that with the media and with political officials to try to sway or build your case?
Yeah, I think that was helpful at that time. And we defeated them. We stopped that incinerator from being built at all.
Right, I remember the marches up Ferry Street with people carrying those signs about SCA. You said there was another example you could give?
The other example was at sea incineration. There was a corporation that got formed, and their goal was to set up a terminal in Newark where they would take in toxic waste from a good chunk of the country and mix them, and then have ships that they owned dock at that terminal in Newark, have the chemicals loaded onto the ship, and then they were going to sail out into the ocean off the Jersey shore and burn the chemicals. And with that, what came into play was more my engineering background, and I was able to take a look at the proposal that they were putting forward, and one, recognized that they were going to mix together chemicals where they didn't even know what they were mixing, which is not real smart to do, and very dangerous. And that in addition, the design of their equipment was not tailored to deal with the level of danger that they were bringing into the neighborhood. So the corporate executives, because he had been used to speaking to financial concerns, financial backers, was sort of flip in the way that he would describe the engineering as using off-the-shelf components. And once I heard that, it's like, well, if you're using off-the-shelf components, that means that they're not designed for a toxic waste facility. They're not designed for this level of danger, and that's the absolutely wrong way to build something like this. In addition, the experience that people throughout the country had with regard to anything similar to this is that people would generally cut corners and break the law whenever they could get away with it. This company was suggesting that they were going to take the chemicals out into the ocean some number of miles off the Jersey coast and burn them, supposedly so that the fumes wouldn't bother anybody. But they would have had to add fuel in order to burn it, and so it was likely that instead of burning it, once they were out of sight, they would just dump the chemicals, because who's going to see? Likewise, if they burned them, all right, how far away from the shore would they burn them? Would they go out 75 miles off the coast, which is what they were claiming they would do, or would they only go out 2 or 3 miles and then have the fumes blowing back to the Jersey shore?
And so Ironbound formed something called the Greater Newark Bay Coalition, right?
Well, for that particular proposal, we formed a coalition. We had already set up the Ironbound Committee Against Toxic Wastes, and we had dealt with the SCA facility through that organization. Once the at-sea proposal got made, the proposal was much larger than just Newark, because it was going to affect anybody that lived anywhere near Newark Bay. It was also going to affect anybody who lived anywhere near the Jersey Shore. So we established a coalition of groups that included groups from Elizabeth. One of the most interesting groups that joined us there was a Girl Scout troop. We added on a number of the health department officials throughout Hudson County. There was a man in Harrison who was very, very helpful for us with that. He had me speak at one of their county meetings, and then the whole group of them took a position against the at-sea proposal. We made connections with folks in Bayonne, because they also border on Newark Bay. In particular, the mayor of Bayonne, the state senator that represented Bayonne, the fire officials from Bayonne, and eventually at one point we were actually able to hold a couple of public meetings in the Bayonne City Council chambers, because everybody in office there supported us. We also had a lot of support in Jersey City, and then also from the Jersey Shore. There was a group down there that was very, very interested in the whole shore area, and they joined with us because they didn't want to have these chemicals blowing back, to people who were using the shore.
And I remember there was a huge demonstration called Revival for Survival, and the yacht club got involved too, right?
Yeah, I think that on one occasion we actually had a parade of boats that sailed through Newark Bay as part of the protest.
And was Greenpeace involved at that one?
Greenpeace, I don't remember whether they were involved at that point or later on when we were dealing with the garbage incinerator. But there was a couple points where they were very, very helpful towards us.
Before we leave the research area, you were also involved in analyzing some of the legislation that the state would propose. Do you remember any of the siting commission hearings, or when they were trying to figure out where they were going to put the garbage incinerators? I think you did a lot of work looking at those issues.
Yeah. What the state was doing is that they were trying to figure out a way to have the public accept whatever they proposed. And they didn't like the fact of people protesting and challenging them at hearings. So what they decided that they would do is that they would create what they called a siting commission. And the siting commission was supposedly going to come up with abstract criteria for siting facilities, and that after they came up with these abstract criteria, that they would then use those criteria to supposedly make rational decisions about where to put dangerous facilities. one thing became apparent very, very quickly is that when they came up with their criteria, they designed them so that it would be utterly impossible to place a toxic waste facility in Livingston or Short Hills or Mahwah, Ramsey, any place that had, any degree of upper middle class or rich people. And the criteria instead were so that they could place them in places where there were a lot of poor people, a lot of working class people. And that's one of the things that we pointed out over and over again, that if these things are so safe, why don't you put it in Short Hills? If there's not going to be any pollution problems, any effect on property values, any danger to public health, we'll put it in Short Hills. I'm sure that they would like to have their taxes lowered, to have a facility like this. But that's not the way anybody was thinking. The thing was to repeat what had been done in the past, which was to site facilities that are dangerous in neighborhoods that were working class neighborhoods where there were poor people, neighborhoods where there were more minority members, whether that was Afro-Americans or Hispanics or even Portuguese like there are in Ironbound. And so I did a lot of work on taking a look at their writing and to point out how it was actually going to affect people in New Jersey and who it was actually going to affect. We then came up with the idea that since they were going to have these hearings and it was going to be a select group of people from their point of view who would necessarily come to the conclusion that the place to site these kind of facilities was in Newark or Elizabeth or Jersey City, that we couldn't trust them to just go ahead and do what they were going to do. So what we did is that we created a thing called an alternative siting commission. And we nominated people for the alternative siting commission, but instead of having all people who were going to side with the rich, we looked for people who would side with working class people and poor people. And we put together a commission that included, I guess at that point, about 25 people. And then we decided that we'd hold an alternative siting hearing. The same way that the DEP was holding hearings, we would hold a hearing. And at that point we had a great relationship with the mayor of Bayonne and the Bayonne City Council, and so they gave us the Bayonne City Council chambers to have the alternative siting commission meeting. And so we set up people who were on our commission to be in a place to listen to the testimony from people who would speak. And then we had neighborhood residents from towns around here, representatives of various groups that were against the proposals, come and then speak at the siting commission. And that proved to be a very, very effective tactic.
It was, and I'm glad you reminded me of that. And then the other issue you did a lot of research on was the dioxin.
Well, dioxin came about when we first started looking at the proposal to put a garbage incinerator in Ironbound. And the thing that became clear is that people had done work around the country on similar issues, and they came to the conclusion that dioxin would be produced in a garbage incinerator, that you're putting together chemicals that would necessarily produce dioxins. Dioxin is a significant chemical because of the damage that it did to the Vietnamese people during the Vietnam War, as well as American soldiers who fought in that war. The government of the U.S. decided that they would dump toxic chemicals on the land in Vietnam. And the main thing that they used was a thing called Agent Orange, which would kill any plant life that it landed on. But there were farmers from Vietnam in the same areas, there were children in schools in the same area, there were American soldiers in the same area, and all of them would be exposed to these chemicals, and they all suffered health damage from that. Dioxin can cause cancers years later. It can cause a very disfiguring type of skin problem called chloracne. And there were American vets that we knew who had been exposed to those chemicals and who were suffering those problems. It can also cause things like nerve damage and eventually kill you, all right, because of the cancer combined with nerve damage and other problems. And there were a lot of American vets that died that way. A lot of them brought home changes in their genetic material such that their children then had to suffer from either birth defects or from cancers. So we were able to find out some information about dioxin. One of the people that was helpful with that was a environmentalist by the name of Barry Commoner, who had done some work both in St. Louis and then later in Queens, New York, on that topic. So where do we go from there?
And then was Dr. Connett involved in the dioxin work?
Well, Connett came in a little bit later, I think. At the beginning, the main person that we learned from was Barry Commoner, with some of the work that he had done in Queens College.
Okay, and so when this governor came in and they said they found dioxin in Ironbound.
Well, that became a second issue, right? The first issue was dioxin in the emissions from the garbage incinerator. And then in 1983, they did some testing, and they found that dioxin was in the island section of Ironbound. And their testing protocols were not very sophisticated. I remember at one point having an argument with the head of the EPA in Jersey over how they were testing, because it made no sense. He wasn't paying any attention to how dioxin would actually move within a neighborhood like Ironbound. He was basing a testing protocol as if he was out in a desert in New Mexico or something. And at that point, we tried to educate the community about the issue, and we sought legal help, and we had a lawyer who was very, very helpful, Michael Gordon, and that case is still going on as far as I know. Michael has been in and out of courts for the last 30 years over it, but the government just doesn't want to do what they need to do. And the private corporations fight them tooth and nail to prevent them from collecting any penalties from those corporations that produce the material. The dioxin was produced at a factory in Ironbound, which actually produced Agent Orange for the U.S. government to use in Vietnam. So we had this very strange relationship, right? Because the chemical had been produced in order to fight the Vietnamese people. And it wound up poisoning their land, poisoning U.S. soldiers, poisoning Vietnamese people. And then in the production of that material, it wound up hurting people here in Ironbound, because that chemical was spread throughout Ironbound. It also polluted the Passaic River and Newark Bay.
Stop right there for a minute.
Okay. So we know that the dioxin was in the neighborhood and that they were proposing an incinerator that was going to produce more dioxin by burning garbage, and it comes out. Can you talk a little bit about the proposal for the garbage incineration, what that technology was about, why it was the technology the state came up with, if you remember that, and what they were proposing statewide to deal with garbage at that time?
Mm-hmm. There had been problems with landfills that had gone on for a number of years, because the techniques that were supposed to be used to make landfills environmentally sound were very often not used, right? Because people wanted to save money and make higher profits. The state came up with an idea that was called resource recovery, and what that basically meant was that you use garbage as a fuel to generate electricity. And so the incinerator in Ironbound, it does produce a small amount of electricity. But the basic thing that's going on there is that you're burning garbage. You're not burning a normal fuel like natural gas or coal or oil. You're burning garbage, and garbage is different than those other fuels. The mix of chemicals that you can get in garbage means that the pollution that comes from a garbage incinerator is going to be very, very different from the pollution that comes from a normal electric generating plant. The state wanted to build 21 of these incinerators, which they were calling resource recovery facilities, because they wanted to convince environmentalists and average people that this was something nice to do for people, all right? Isn't it nice to recover resources? Isn't it nice to make use of things and to reuse things? And they were trying to use that as a way to avoid the topic of air pollution that was going to come from the plant. So their design was to build 21 of these plants throughout the state of New Jersey. Each county was supposed to be responsible for building one of them. Now, the people that were involved with the building, they all understood that it was going to be a polluting facility. And so what would happen is that each county would site a facility so that it was at the extreme eastern end of the county, so that the pollution would blow into the next county. So in Essex County, the ironbound section of Newark is at the extreme eastern end of the county, so that's what they wanted to put it here. If they had sited the facility on the western end of the county, the pollution would have blown over Essex County. But they wanted instead for the pollution to blow in general towards Hudson County. So they put it here. In the course of the struggle against that incinerator, one of the things that I pointed out to them is that the facility was designed to be much, much larger than anything that was actually necessary. And that given the way the contracts were written, the charge of that the facility would charge Essex County to dispose of garbage at the incinerator was set at a certain figure. At that point, I think it was somewhere between $75 and $100 per ton. But since the facility was designed to be much, much larger than what was actually necessary, what would inevitably then occur is that they would import garbage from other places to burn at this facility. Now, they're advertising it to be something that's going to just take care of Essex County garbage, but the reality is that the design of it was for a facility much larger than what would be necessary. And so, a few years later, they started importing garbage from New York City. So what they had been claiming was that that would never ever happen, and yet 2 or 3 years after they built the facility, it was already happening. That's bad enough, okay, because now you've got the pollution coming from garbage that was generated somewhere else, in this case New York City. But in addition, the financing of it was structured in such a way that they could charge New York any amount of money that they wanted. And so in order to get the contract to burn the garbage from New York, they lowballed their estimates and the charges that they actually wound up charging New York City. So residents of Essex County, where the facility was sited, are paying between $75 and $100 a ton, and residents of New York City are paying between $30 and $50 a ton. Now, I pointed that out in the contracts when I first saw them, and the DEP and the rest of the state government, of course, lied about it and said, no, that would never occur, that can't possibly occur. And 2 or 3 years after the facility was built, that's exactly what did occur.
And when you would research something like the contract, I think we called it a sweetheart contract at one point. We used to write about it in the Ironbound Voices newspaper. Can you talk a little bit about the newspaper and its role in some of the issues that we were dealing with?
Well, from the time that we set up Ironbound Voices, what was very, very clear in my head is that whatever work that we did in terms of research would be published in Ironbound Voices. Likewise, any of the events that occurred around work that we did on various issues would also be published. So that the knowledge of the work, the knowledge of the issues, the knowledge of the research that was done would be shared with as many people as we possibly could. And Ironbound Voices turned out to serve that function. We published it in 3 languages, so it was mainly in English from the beginning of the writing of articles, but then we translated our articles into both Portuguese and Spanish. Given that Ironbound is a multi-ethnic neighborhood where a lot of people's first language was either Portuguese or Spanish, we thought that that was something that was absolutely necessary to do. You have another question?
Was there a feeling that the normal media could not tell the story?
Well, the feeling was that the normal media would refuse to tell a story, that they would, if they covered any of the issues that we were involved in, they would tell a story that was very much slanted towards the politicians and towards the corporations that existed, that they would not give the point of view of a normal, working person or poor person living in Newark. And what we wanted to do was to provide information from the point of view of your average working person, average poor person who lives in Newark, who has to suffer with all the abuses, environmental or whatever, and who normally doesn't get their point of view heard anywhere.
One of the things you touched on a little bit was that groups like Greenpeace occasionally came to Ironbound and worked on an issue. Dr. Commoner, Barry Commoner, and Lois Gibbs. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of people like that coming to this neighborhood to bring information?
Well, what we were trying to do when we first started with environmental work was to make links with whomever we could. And so we started by making outreach to the normal environmental organizations that exist. For air pollution issues, there was the American Lung Association, the American Cancer Association. There were groups like the Natural Resources Defense Council, and a few others of that type. And what we learned very, very quickly is that those groups were on the other side of the fence. They were the same people that were pushing for the abuses against a neighborhood like Ironbound, against a city like Newark. They represented the interests of upper middle class and upper class people, not average Americans. So those initial attempts that we made to hook up with what we thought would be people who would support us, the environmental organizations that existed, those didn't work. Okay, so then we looked around to find out if there was anybody that actually was taking a stand from the point of view of just an average, person. And Lois Gibbs was one person like that. She stood up to the government at Love Canal. And at one point, I think she actually got accused of kidnapping 2 of the EPA officials and holding them prisoner. In any case, her work, 1, made it into a national issue, and 2, got things done, things that would not have been done if she had not been there, had not taken those stands. So we got in touch with Lois Gibbs, and she was in the process of setting up an organization in Washington, D.C., and her husband was a scientist who was a researcher, and so we began to communicate with Lois. And on the issue of at-sea incineration and of SCA, she was very, very supportive. And so we were able to work together, establish a relationship. On the issue of garbage incineration, initially she was on the same side as all these other organizations that were opposing us. And so what I had to do at one point was to write a very, very long research paper to then send to her husband to read, since her husband was a scientist. And he studied that paper for about 6 months before they were willing to change their mind and join us in the fight against the garbage incinerator. We then held a meeting at one point in Newark where we invited her to come, and there was actually a movie that had been done about her, and to come bring the movie and show it and then speak. And I think there was a Portuguese sports club one night, and that then laid the basis for an organization that we called GRIO, Grassroots Environmental Organization. And the way that came about was we invited a number of people from around the state to join us at that occasion with Lois Gibbs. And then we all went out to dinner to one of the Portuguese restaurants afterwards, and that's where we got talking about setting up a statewide organization, and the organization got formed.
And the organization stopped a lot of the garbage incinerators, right?
Well, GRIO was somewhat involved with that. All right, we also, right after that, set up another statewide organization that was specifically targeted towards the garbage incinerators. That organization was called SMOKE. All right, and we probably defeated 19 out of 21. I think there's only maybe 1 or 2 that got built in the state of New Jersey, and we killed every other one of them. Ironically, there was one that was proposed for Passaic, and I turned on my TV one night, and I'm watching the people protest in Passaic, and one of the people who's one of the leaders of the organization was my great aunt that I hadn't seen in years, Chutka Anielka, right? And she's on TV protesting against the incinerator in Passaic. That one was also defeated.
All right, yeah. Well, nobody really wanted those, and I remember there was a meeting of GRIO where I remember a picture of a cake that says New Jersey and you, New Jersey and you, and toxic waste too. It was New Jersey and you was the slogan that they had.
That was a play off of a slogan that there was a guy who was the governor then called Governor Kane, and he was using a slogan similar to that to advertise the tourist industry along the Jersey Shore.
Right.
And he was calling it something like New Jersey and you perfect together. And then he would actually do some of the ads himself on both TV and radio, to get his face in front of the public and whatnot. And so we were trying to play off the slogan that he was using.
So having somebody like Lois Gibbs here was very inspiring for people, right?
It was a little bit inspiring. I wouldn't want to put too much weight on it. Lois, the main function for Lois coming here was our ability to then set up statewide coalitions, which we may not have been able to do without her help. In terms of neighborhood organizing, nobody here really knew who she was. The people that we were in contact with around the state that were heading up organizations similar to ours, they all knew who she was. And she had a great reputation within that arena. So when we were setting up GRIO, it was very, very important that we have touch with Lois. But in terms of neighborhood organizing, I don't think it had any impact at all.
Mm-hmm. What about Greenpeace? Anything?
Greenpeace was peripheral. I don't think that they had any big, impact. There was one demonstration that we held, I think, out in Livingston by Kane's family home. And I think that they provided us with some blow-up balloons or something like that at that blow-up smokestack or something like that.
Mm-hmm. I remember them hanging some nice signs on Raymond Boulevard from the overpasses. Mm-hmm. In your opinion, this is a very general question, but the effects of the work of ICATW, what sticks out as the most important thing?
Well, the first thing is that we got a number of toxic waste sites cleaned up in Ironbound. There were a number of smaller sites where factories had basically been loaded with barrels of toxic chemicals, and we got those cleaned up. It took us a while, but we got it done. We defeated 2 major new proposals to bring more toxic waste into Ironbound, the SCA proposal and the ATC proposal. We fought the incinerator in Essex County. We lost that battle, but the ramifications of that battle is that people won similar battles in 19 other counties because of the groundwork that we laid on the issue. We had stirred up so much interest in it. We had stirred up so much consciousness about the dangers of these kinds of facilities that people were able to use that and use the initiative that we took to defeat one after another, after another, after another. We also broke the momentum that had occurred between corporations, the state government, and these supposed environmental organizations like the research one I talked about and the American Lung Association and whatnot, where they didn't have that strong tie between them anymore. They couldn't use environmentalists to advocate in favor of something like an incinerator anymore, because we made it taboo. We made it that they could no longer do those kinds of things. And so we stopped a lot of the propaganda that was coming from the environmental community itself. We also set an example, I think, for local organizing throughout New Jersey, which GRIA was able to foster. And without that, there would have been, probably, 40 or 50 other organizations that never would have worked in communities throughout New Jersey, except for the fact that Ironbound Committee Against Toxic Waste showed what could be done. We showed success. We showed our ability to speak to the media. We showed our ability to hold demonstrations. We showed our ability to speak at government functions like Citing Criteria Commission meetings and DEP hearings on various things. And the impact of that, I think, was enormous. In addition, we had national impact because we changed the philosophy of Lois Gibbs about it. Lois Gibbs went from being supportive of some of those types of facilities to being 100% against. We had touch at that time also with progressive religious community. There were a number of ministers in Ironbound that were very helpful towards our work, and one of them was the Church of Christ. And Dave Burgess was a pastor of a church from that denomination. Well, Church of Christ wound up taking some of what we said and using it nationally. They used it nationally. They set up a commission of their own within their own church group. I think Ben Chavis eventually became the leader of that. And they took one of our slogans and used it nationally. When we were dealing with issues here, given the fact that Ironbound was both a multi-ethnic and a multiracial neighborhood, and the fact that the first proposal, SCA, was going to be built next to an essentially all African American housing project, and would have been polluting that housing project, making those kids there breathe in all of these toxic chemicals. What we did is we talked about a concept that we called environmental racism. That environmental proposals like these incinerators being put in areas where there were large concentrations of African Americans was another form of racism, all right? Because now what you're going to do is you're going to make these kids breathe in the junk that's coming from other parts of the state, other parts of the United States. And so Ben Chavis then took on that concept of environmental racism within the Church of Christ, and it became very, very effective in communicating that around other parts of the country. There were lots of places down south which eventually took on various toxic waste proposals, various landfill proposals, various incinerator proposals that were led by African Americans in those communities. And I think that our work in calling it environmental racism in terms of what was being done here in Newark was something that was significant then throughout the South in the United States.
So that kind of answers the question I was going to ask about the placement of ICATW's work in the whole environmental justice movement, or can you elaborate more on that?
Well, I think that the work here in Ironbound and the ICATW was absolutely breakthrough work in terms of establishing consciousness throughout the country about some of the issues that we were talking about and showing what could be done. We fought them, we beat them twice. We beat them on two really big issues, okay? We were able to connect the dots between corporate America and organized crime and politicians and, the people in the financial industries that are involved with the bonds that fund these kinds of facilities. And I think that people who did work in succeeding years all over the U.S., they were influenced by what we did here.
Do you remember working on the right to know law?
Yeah.
Can you talk a little about that?
Well, there were some proposals that were coming out with regard to people in neighborhoods having the right to know what chemicals were being stored in their neighborhood, what chemicals were being used in their neighborhood. And so at the point that regulations were being created around those concepts, we got involved. Now, at that point, we did not succeed in getting what we wanted. We worked with a coalition of labor groups and community groups in New Jersey, and the proposal that we put forward at that time was that since every city has a firehouse, sometimes many, many firehouses, that all of the information be accessible at computer terminals placed in every firehouse in the state of New Jersey. And what we figured was that, one, the firemen needed to know what chemicals were being stored before they went into a fire, because they had to protect themselves. They had to know what they were dealing with. They had to know what doesn't mix. But in addition, since the firemen needed that information, and they could get it through a computer terminal set up at their firehouse, well, that could also then be accessible to everybody in the neighborhood surrounding the firehouse, which meant essentially everybody in New Jersey. We fought for that for a while, and it got knocked down. We lost on that. So the right to know existed, but there was no real way for people to get information. They would file requests with the state, and then the state would delay for 6 months, a year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years before they would even answer them. Whereas what we wanted was to have all that information online in a local place, meaning a firehouse. Now, this is the time before everybody had personal computers and before everybody had cell phones, right? So we're talking about a more primitive level of technology that could not be placed in everybody's home. Today, you could get that kind of information in your house. But at that time, to have it centrally located in firehouses, that would have been a big breakthrough, but we lost.
Mm. And because that was a federal law, right, to know, right? And
no, I think that was a state one
at
that time.
I think the state law became the sort of the model for federal legislation that got passed after it, because recently one of our senators came to Ironbound, and he was saying it was the 25th anniversary of the passage of that federal law. So I don't know. I guess they must have followed it up with federal legislation, but it did start in New Jersey, I guess. I think that is the end of the questioning that I have here, Bob. Unless while we've been talking, you've thought of some other things that you might want to add?
No.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay.